The room was dead silent, 6 attorneys, a mahogany table, and $400 million sitting on paper, frozen, untouchable, because of a single name none of them had ever heard before. Attorney Kliebert set the document down slowly, removed his glasses, and looked around at the family of Edward Parks. Alicia, his eldest daughter, sat at the head of the table. Her suit was perfect. Her expression was not. Morris, his son, stared at the table like it owed him an apology. Adrian already had her phone out, already calling someone. They had come here expecting one thing: their money. What they got instead was a name: Linda. No last name, no address, no explanation, just a legal clause iron tight that said, clearly, coldly, and without any room for argument, that until this woman signed the document, no one in this family would receive a single dollar. Alicia's voice, when it finally came, was sharp enough to cut glass. Who is she? Nobody in that room could answer. But across town, in a hospital laundry facility that smelled of bleach and long hours, a woman named Linda was folding sheets and thinking about whether she could afford her mother's medication this month. She had no idea that a billionaire had just died. She had no idea that his entire family was sitting in a room furious, trying to figure out who she was. And she had absolutely no idea that Edward Parks had written her a letter sealed for 4 years. A letter that could only be opened when she was in the room. What that letter said would shock everyone, including Linda herself. Kliebert had done this many times before. He had sat in rooms just like this one. Expensive rooms, quiet rooms, rooms that smelled of leather and old money. And he had read the final words of people who were no longer alive to speak for themselves. He had learned over 30 years of practice to read without feeling, to deliver without editorializing, to remain still while the people around him fell apart. But as he turned to the second page of Edward Parks' will that morning, even he paused for just a breath longer than necessary. He read the clause once. Then he read it again. Then he set the document flat on the table and looked at the family. The estate was everything the newspapers had estimated and more. $400 million, properties in 5 states, a private equity stake in 3 companies, a charitable endowment already in operation. It was a life's work laid out in neat legal language, and for the first 60 seconds of the reading, the family had absorbed it with the careful composure of people who had been waiting a long time and did not want to appear too eager. Then Kliebert read the clause. 1 signature was required before any portion of the estate could be released, transferred, or accessed by any named heir. Not a business partner, not a board member, not a co-signatory on any existing account. A woman, first name only, no last name provided, no address, no contact information of any kind, just a name and a legal condition so precisely worded that it left no room for interpretation, exception, or appeal. The room did not explode. It went very, very quiet. Alicia was the first to speak. She asked Kliebert to repeat it. He did. She asked him what it meant. He told her what it meant. She asked him if there was any way around it. He told her there was not. She sat back in her chair. Her jaw was tight. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her, perfectly still, the way a person holds themselves still when what they actually want to do is overturn something heavy. Morris said nothing. The color had simply drained from his face, slowly and completely like water leaving a glass. Adrian did not wait for further explanation. She was already stepping away from the table, already speaking in a low, urgent voice into her phone, summoning her own attorney from across the city as if speed alone could undo what had just been read aloud. Kliebert let them react. He had learned that too. When to speak and when to simply wait for the storm to pass its first peak. He explained, but when the room was ready to hear him, that the clause had been drafted and notarized 11 months before Edward Parks's death, not in the fog of a new diagnosis, not in a moment of confusion or fear. 11 months before the end, when Edward had known exactly what was coming, when he had possessed every opportunity to change course, to simplify, to be generous in the conventional way that wealthy men are expected to be generous. He had chosen not to. Alicia asked if that meant the will could be contested. Kliebert told her she was welcome to try. His tone did not change. It did not need to. By the time the meeting concluded, very little had been resolved and a great deal had been set into motion. Adrian left without saying goodbye. Morris lingered near the window for a moment, staring at nothing in particular, before quietly following her out. Alicia remained seated the longest. She sat across from Kliebert with an expression that was working very hard to stay composed, and she told him that she wanted someone found, someone thorough, someone discreet. She named McClure. Kliebert confirmed that he knew the name. He said nothing further. By end of day, McClure had been contacted, briefed, and retained. He was a compact, unhurried man who had built his career on finding things that people did not want found. He asked the right questions, took his notes, and accepted the case with the calm efficiency of someone for whom complexity was simply Tuesday. His instructions from Alicia were precise. Find the woman, evaluate her, determine her connection to Edward Parks, and if there was any legal angle, any weakness in the clause, and any irregularity in the documentation, anything at all, find it and bring it back. He shook hands with Alicia's attorney and turned to leave. He was nearly at the door when Kliebert spoke. Not loudly, not to the room, just to McClure in a voice low enough that Alicia, still gathering her things at the far end of the table, could not make out the words. McClure stopped. He turned slightly. He listened, and then something shifted in his expression, something small and difficult to name, something that moved through his eyes and was gone almost before it arrived. He nodded once. He left. Alicia looked at Kliebert. She asked what he had said. Kliebert folded his hands on the table. I gave him some context, he said. She waited for more. He offered nothing, and in the long silence that followed, the only sound in the room was the distant hum of the city 30 floors below, indifferent and endless, carrying on without them. McClure had found people before, complicated people, people with things to hide and reasons to run, people who had built entire second lives in cities where no one knew their real names. That was his work, and he was good at it, and he had long since stopped being surprised by what he uncovered when he started pulling at threads. He was not prepared for Linda. He found her in 2 days. It took him less than an afternoon to locate the address, a third-floor apartment in a neighborhood that was neither dangerous nor comfortable, just worn, the kind of place where people lived not because they chose it, but because it was what the math allowed. He spent the rest of those 2 days watching. But that was his process. Before he ever knocked on a door, he needed to understand what was behind it. What was behind Linda's door was a life stripped down to its essentials and maintained with extraordinary care. He watched her leave for the hospital before 6 in the morning, her uniform already pressed, her bag over one shoulder, moving through the early dark with the steady pace of someone who had made this walk so many times that her feet knew it without being told. He watched her return after 3 in the afternoon, buy 2 items from the corner store and go back upstairs. He watched her leave again at 7 for her weekend shift at an office cleaning company 3 neighborhoods over. Returning close to midnight, her steps slower but her back still straight. He ran the checks he always ran, financial records, public filings. Any legal history. He looked for debts, disputes, judgments, anything Alicia could use to characterize this woman as a problem rather than a person. He found nothing. Her record was clean in the way that only very honest people's records are clean. Not scrubbed, not managed, just genuinely empty of incident. She paid her bills on time when she had the money to pay them and called ahead when she didn't. She had no credit cards. She had a savings account with a balance that would have made most people uncomfortable to look at, but which she apparently treated as the only safety net available to her. Every month, without fail, a transfer left that account and traveled to a bank in Central America. On the second evening, McClure sat in his car outside her building and looked at what his notes had given him. There was nothing there. There was absolutely nothing there. And after 22 years of doing this work, he knew the difference between nothing that was hidden and nothing that was simply nothing. This was simply nothing. He went upstairs and knocked on her door. She opened it without the chain, which told him something. Not carelessness, something else. A woman who had nothing to fear from a stranger at her door because she had nothing worth taking and had long since made her peace with that fact. She was in her 40s with the kind of face that would have looked younger if life had been gentler. Her eyes were steady and a little tired in the permanent way of someone for whom rest was always just slightly out of reach. Behind her, the apartment was small and immaculate, a kitchen where everything had its place. A living room where a narrow shelf held more library books than anything else. On the wall near the door, school certificates were taped in a careful row, each one straight, each one belonging to a boy named Ethan. Beside them, a single photograph in a simple frame, a man smiling at a table somewhere warm, somewhere that was not here, somewhere that no longer existed. McClure introduced himself carefully. He explained that he was working on behalf of an estate. He told her the name. Linda listened. Her expression did not change much, but he was watching closely and he saw the moment, the precise moment, when the name Edward Parks landed and found no recognition at all. Not suppressed recognition, not careful blankness, genuine unperformed confusion. She shook her head slowly. "There must be a mistake," she said. I never met anyone named Edward Parks." She was not nervous when she said it. She was not calculating. She was tired and a little puzzled and entirely telling the truth. McClure had spent his career reading people, and he knew with the certainty that came from long practice that she believed exactly what she was saying. He thanked her. He told her someone would be in touch. He walked back down the stairs and out into the evening air and sat in his car for a long time without starting the engine. Then he picked up his phone. He did not call Alicia. He scrolled past her name and kept going until he reached Kliebert's. It rang twice. "She has no idea who he was," McClure said. The pause that followed was not the pause of surprise. It was the pause of a man who already knew and had been waiting for someone else to catch up. I know," Kliebert said quietly. "That's precisely the point." McClure lowered the phone. Through the windshield, the hospital entrance glowed under pale fluorescent light. Somewhere inside, Linda had already gone back to work. She did not know what was coming. She did not know that a dead man had spent 4 years looking for her, or that his family was already building a case to erase her, or that the only thing standing between her and that machinery was an attorney who wouldn't explain himself and a private investigator who had just decided, without quite meaning to, that he was no longer certain whose side he was on. He sat there for a long time. The engine stayed off. The city moved around him, indifferent as always. And he thought about what Kliebert had whispered to him at the door. The judge reviewed Kliebert's filing for 11 minutes. That was all it took. Alicia's attorneys had arrived with confidence, the kind that comes from expensive suits and a long history of winning. They had prepared arguments around precedent, around the ambiguity of identifying a person by first name alone, around the question of whether a clause so vague could be considered legally enforceable. They were good arguments. They had worked before, in other cases, against other opponents. They had not been prepared for Edward Parks. Kliebert's documentation was not simply thorough. It was exhaustive in a way that felt almost personal, as though the man who had commissioned it had sat quietly in a room somewhere and thought through every possible challenge, every angle of attack, every weakness someone might try to find. And had then methodically sealed each one shut. The clause had been drafted by 3 independent attorneys. It had been reviewed by a 4th. It had been notarized, witnessed, and filed with redundancies that made it nearly impossible to unseat without challenging the entire will, a process that would take years and cost more than it could ever recover. The judge denied the motion without calling for a recess. Alicia walked out of the courthouse without speaking to anyone. Her attorneys fell into step behind her, offering context she had not asked for, suggesting next steps she was not ready to hear. She got into her car and sat with her hands in her lap and stared through the windshield at a city that was moving forward without her permission, as cities always do. The estate remained frozen, the clause held. As in somewhere across town, Linda's phone lit up before her alarm did. She had not been sleeping deeply. She rarely did on nights before something uncertain. She reached for the phone out of habit and found a notification from a news app she barely used. A headline that had been shared enough times overnight to surface at the top of everything. She read it once. Then she read it again. Parks Air drama. Mystery woman named in will. Sources suggest secret relationship. Her photograph was not in the article, but her first name was, and the neighborhood was mentioned, and the hospital where she worked was described as the facility where she was employed. Whoever had given the information to the tabloid had known enough to make her findable. They had simply not cared what that would cost her. By the time she arrived at work that morning, her supervisor was already waiting near the staff entrance. He was a careful man, not unkind, but deeply uncomfortable with anything that brought outside attention through his doors. He asked her quietly and with visible awkwardness whether there was something he needed to know. She told him there was not. He nodded in a way that suggested he was not entirely satisfied but could not think of what else to ask. She went to her station and began her shift. At lunch, a neighbor she had shared a building with for 6 years passed her in the lobby and looked at the floor. A teacher from Ethan's school left a voicemail that was carefully worded and said almost nothing, but its meaning was plain enough. Two women she recognized from the laundry room at the end of her building's hall went quiet when she entered and did not start talking again until she left. She had spent years learning to exist inside spaces where she was not entirely welcomed. She had learned to carry that without showing it, to keep her face still and her pace steady and her voice even when what she felt beneath all of it was something much older and heavier than embarrassment. But this was different. This was her name attached to a story that was not hers. This was a lie she could not correct, spreading through her life in every direction at once, reaching into rooms she had built carefully over years and rearranging them without her permission. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with her phone in her hand and called Kliebert's office. She told his assistant she was withdrawing. She did not want to appear. She did not want the money. She had never asked for any of this, had never done anything to deserve being placed inside this family's war, and she wanted her name removed from every document that carried it. She was still talking when Ethan came in from the hallway. He had heard enough from the doorway to understand. He crossed the kitchen quietly and held out his hand for the phone. She looked at him, this boy who was nearly as tall as her now, who had his father's eyes and a steadiness she was not entirely sure where he had gotten, and after a moment she gave it to him. He told the assistant that his mother would call back. He ended the call. He set the phone on the table between them and looked at her with an expression that was too composed for his age. Mom, he said, he knew your name. She started to speak. He kept going gently. After all these years of people looking right through you, one person knew your name. He paused. Don't you want to know why? The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on the street below. Linda sat with her hands around a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago and looked at her son and did not say anything for a very long time. She showed up the next morning. She came alone, or so she thought. But as she approached the building's entrance, a figure stepped away from the wall beside the door. McClure. Not in the posture of someone waiting to intercept her, but in the posture of someone who had been hoping she would come. He spoke quietly. Whatever he said took less than a minute. Yet he did not touch her arm or gesture toward the door. He simply spoke and she listened, and when he finished, she looked at him for a long moment with an expression that passed through something complicated before settling into something else entirely. She nodded once. She squared her shoulders, not with anger, not with performance, but with the particular straightness of someone who has made a decision and is now simply carrying it forward, and she walked through the door. She did not look like a woman walking into a room full of people who wanted to destroy her. She looked like someone who was finally, after a very long time, ready to hear the truth. The conference room was exactly what Linda had expected, and nothing she had been ready for. She had imagined the table. She had imagined the attorneys. She had imagined the air of it, that particular chill that lives in rooms where money and power have been present so long they have become part of the furniture. What she had not imagined was how small she would feel walking through the door, and how quickly she would decide that she was not going to let herself feel that way. She sat down across from all of them. No attorney beside her, no advocate, nothing in her hands. Just the steadiness that McClure's words had settled into her chest on the steps outside, and the quiet she had carried with her from a kitchen table where her son had asked her one question and then trusted her to answer it correctly. Alicia was at the head of the table. She did not look at Linda directly, which was its own kind of statement, the deliberate non-acknowledgement of someone who had decided that looking would confer a dignity she was not willing to grant. Her hands were folded in front of her. Her expression was controlled in the way of someone who had learned control as a survival skill and had long since confused it with strength. Morris sat to Alicia's left. He was staring at the table, not at his hands, not at Linda, not at anything in particular, just the table, as though if he looked at it hard enough, it might offer him something useful. Adrienne had brought 2 attorneys and placed them on either side of her like armrests. She whispered something to the one on her right. He wrote it down without looking up. Kliebert sat at the far end. In front of him, uncentered on the table with the precision of something long planned, was an envelope, cream-colored, sealed, the kind that had once been expensive and now simply looked serious. No one spoke. Kliebert let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to. Then he explained, in the same measured tone he used for everything, that Edward Parks had prepared this letter 4 years before his death, that its instructions were written on the outside of the envelope in Edward's own hand and had been notarized along with the will itself, that those instructions were unambiguous. The letter was to be opened and read aloud only when Linda was physically present in the room, not before, not in her absence, not in summary or in part, only now, only here, only with her sitting exactly where she was sitting. Alicia began to speak. Kliebert opened the envelope. The sound of the paper unfolding was very loud in the silence. He read, Edward Parks had not written like a billionaire. He had written like a man who had finally run out of reasons to be careful with his words. The letter did not open with a legal language or formal address. It opened with a date, a Tuesday, 7 years ago, and then it simply described an evening. He wrote about the worst night of his life. His wife had been buried 4 days earlier. The grief was still so new it didn't feel like grief yet. It felt like something structural had failed, like a wall had come down and the sky was now where the ceiling used to be. He had gone to the hospital alone because a symptom had frightened him and he could not bring himself to call his children, but from whom he had been distant for years in the particular way of men who mistake presence at a dinner table for closeness. He wrote that he had sat on a bench in a hospital corridor and understood for the first time in his 71 years that he was completely alone, not temporarily alone, fundamentally. That the life he had built, the $400 million, the properties, the partnerships, the reputation, had not in the end produced a single person he felt he could call at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night when he was frightened. And then a woman had sat beside him. She had come off a long shift. He could see it in the way she moved. She had opened a container of food, rice and something warm, and after a moment she had simply offered him half. He had not known what to say. He had taken it. And she had asked him if he had someone to call. He had said no. She had nodded as though this was information she understood, and she had stayed. She had not asked who he was. She had not tried to fill the silence with anything unnecessary. She had simply remained in the uncomplicated way of someone for whom the presence of another person was enough of a reason to stay. He had fallen asleep on that bench. When he woke up, she was gone. He wrote that he had spent the next 4 years trying to find her, that when he finally did, he chose not to reach out directly, because a woman who gives without expectation, he wrote, does not need to be thanked. She needs to be witnessed. She needs someone to say in a room she cannot ignore in front of people who will be forced to sit still and hear it. You were seen. What you did mattered. You are not invisible. So he had written a letter. And he had made his family come and sit across from her, 1/3 of the estate to Linda, the remainder to a charitable foundation established in her name, its purpose carved into its founding documents in plain language, to see people whom the world has chosen not to look at. Kliebert set the pages down. The room did not move. Alicia stood after a long moment, picked up her bag and walked to the door. She did not look at Linda. She did not look at Morris. She did not look at anything except the exit, and then she was through it, and the sound of her heels in the corridor outside diminished and was gone. Morris did not move. He sat very still with his eyes on the table and his hands in his lap. And he looked like a man who was doing a kind of accounting he had not been prepared to do today. Adrienne's attorneys were whispering. She was not listening to them. The room was utterly quiet, and then Linda spoke. Her voice was steady. She was not looking at Morris or at Adrienne or at any of the attorneys. She was looking at the envelope still resting in Kliebert's hands, and her question was very quiet and very precise. Did he say anything else? In the letter, was there anything he didn't read aloud? Kliebert looked at her. Something moved across his face, not surprise, not discomfort, but something closer to the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time to reach a specific moment and has now arrived at it. And he said, "Yes." He reached into the envelope and removed a single folded page that he had set aside before beginning to read. He did not unfold it. He did not look at it. He simply slid it across the table directly to her and withdrew his hand. Linda unfolded it slowly. We did not see what it said. We saw her eyes move across the page line by line in the particular way of someone reading something they will never read for the first time again. We saw the moment, the exact moment, when something in her face changed, not broke, changed. The way a held breath finally releases, the way a door long closed finally opens inward. She pressed the page against her chest. She closed her eyes, and she exhaled, slowly, completely, like a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had only just now been given permission to set it down. She signed on a Tuesday. Kliebert slid the document across the table and placed a pen beside it without ceremony, the way he did everything. Without drama, without comment, with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that the most important moments rarely need to be announced. Linda looked at the page for just a second. Then she picked up the pen and signed her name in the same careful, unhurried hand she used for everything. And it was done. $400 million moved. The frozen estate, still and silent for weeks, began to flow again like water released from a dam, into accounts, into trusts, into the legal architecture that Edward Parks had spent years constructing around a purpose no one in his family had understood until now. Linda folded the private page and placed it in her bag. No one asked about it. No one would ever ask about it publicly. It was hers, the only part of all of this that belonged entirely and only to her. And she had already decided that it would stay that way. She gathered her things and walked toward the door. She was nearly to the elevator when she heard footsteps behind her. Not Kliebert's measured pace, not the brisk efficiency of an attorney with somewhere to be. These were slower, hesitant in the way of someone who has made a decision and is still deciding whether they made it correctly. Morris. He caught up to her just before the elevator doors and stopped a careful distance away. Oh, as though he did not want to crowd her, as though he was aware that he had already taken up more of her space than he had any right to. He looked different outside the conference room, smaller. The ambient authority of the table and the attorneys and the family name had not followed him into the hallway, and without it, he was just a man in an expensive suit who was having a very hard time finding the right words. He did not apologize for the legal challenge. He did not apologize for Alicia or for Adrian or for any collective failing of the Parks family. He seemed to understand somehow that those apologies would have been presumptuous, that they would have made the moment about the family again, which was precisely what the moment was not about. He apologized for himself. All for sitting in that room and looking at her the way he had looked at her, for the assumptions he had carried through the door, for the version of himself that had arrived that morning expecting a scandal and had spent the first 20 minutes of the letter being quietly, irreversibly rearranged. He said his father had told him once, when Morris was young enough, that he had only half listened, that the truest measure of a person was how they treated someone who could do nothing for them. He said he had not thought about that in a long time. He was thinking about it now. It was not a grand moment. It was awkward in the way of real things. Halting in the way of real apologies, stripped of the polish that the Parks name usually lent to everything it touched. Linda looked at him for a moment, then she nodded. Simply and without performance, and stepped into the elevator. She did not need to forgive him aloud. She already had, not for his sake, but because she was not a person who had ever had the luxury of carrying extra weight. McClure was waiting on the steps outside. He was not in the posture of someone with more to say. He had said what he needed to say that morning at the door, and he was not a man who repeated himself. He simply held out a business card as she passed. She took it. On the back, in small handwriting that looked like it belonged to someone more careful than his profession suggested, were 5 words. He was right about you. She put the card in her bag beside the folded page and walked to her car. In the months that followed, the world expected Linda to disappear into the transformation, to move, to change. was to become someone new and unrecognizable, the way people assume money remakes everything it touches. She did not. She went back to the hospital by choice, a fact that baffled her supervisor, who asked her twice to confirm it and both times received the same quiet answer. She worked 2 more years, the same shifts, the same hallways, with the one difference being that she no longer sent money home because her mother was no longer far away. She had brought her a small woman with Linda's eyes and the particular serenity of someone who had endured a great deal and decided to be grateful for the years that remained. Her mother slept in a room that was larger than their entire apartment in Central America, and every morning she sat by the window in the thin, early light and said that she did not mind having waited, because the place she had arrived at made the waiting make sense. The foundation opened the following spring. The inaugural event was not large or lavish. Linda had been specific about that. It was held in a community space in the neighborhood where she had lived for 11 years, and the people who attended were the kinds of people who did not usually get invited to events in their honor. Hospital workers, school aides, overnight cleaners, crossing guards, the invisible infrastructure of ordinary life made briefly visible in a single room. Someone near the end of the evening asked Linda what she remembered about that night with the old man on the bench. She considered the question the way she considered everything, without hurry, without performance. I remember he looked like someone who hadn't been spoken to in a long time, she said. So I spoke to him. The room was quiet for a moment after that. Not the silence of discomfort, but the silence of people recognizing something true. Behind her, carved into the wall in letters that were neither large nor small but simply present, was the last line of Edward Parks's letter. The part Kliebert had read aloud to a room full of people who had needed to hear it, to see people whom the world has chosen not to look at. Ethan was in the audience. He had his phone out, not to scroll, not to be somewhere else, but to take a photograph of his mother at the podium in front of those words. When he got home that night, he printed it. He put it on the wall beside his school awards, which were still taped there in a careful row, at each one straight, exactly as they had always been. He had to move one of them slightly to make room. He did not mind. And in a hospital across the city, in a corridor that no one thought of as significant, there was a bench. Ordinary, empty most hours, the kind of bench 10,000 people passed every day without looking at it, without thinking about it, without knowing or caring what had once happened there. On the armrest, almost too small to notice, was a plaque. It had not been commissioned by the foundation. It had not been installed by anyone in the Parks family. It had simply appeared one morning, fixed in place with the quiet permanence of something that had been waiting to exist. 4 words, that was all. EP sat here. Someone stayed. If this story moved you even a little, it is because you already know this truth. Well, you have always known it. The most important things we ever do are the ones no one is watching. The kindness that cost us something real. The choice to stay when leaving would have been so much easier. Somewhere out there tonight, someone is sitting on a bench in an empty corridor, frightened and alone, hoping without quite daring to hope that someone might notice. Be the one who notices. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, because sometimes the only thing standing between a person and the longest night of their life is a stranger willing to sit down and stay.